The single most consequential event in Chicago's history started with a small fire in a cow barn in a poor Irish neighborhood on the southwest side. It was October 1871, and the Midwest had been hit with a severe drought. The fire spread with such terrifying speed that within hours it generated its own weather pattern, spawning tornadoes of fire.
During the fire, it was lighting up in the sky to read a newspaper at night. In Winnetka, Dennis Klopfer.
The inferno raged for 2 days, wiping out the entire business district and 18,000 buildings. The tragedy offered an unprecedented opportunity to rebuild a major city from the ground up. Architects, engineers, carpenters, promoters, investors, speculators rushed in from all over the world. 14 years later, Chicago erected the world's first skyscraper. But in the fire's immediate aftermath, 1/3 of the city was left homeless. Out of 300,000 residents, 100,000 needed shelter. Nearly half moved to the North Shore, doubling the population overnight. For years after the Chicago fire, it was not unusual to see homeless men traipsing up and down the train tracks in search of work, food, or shelter. Many homeless lived in shanties and tents in the dense woods north of Tower Road. Some unscrupulous businessmen took advantage of the situation. Chicago realtor E. Ashley Mears built 14 mansions in Lakeside, just south of Tower Road, all in a row so as to be visible from the passing trains. It was Winnetka's first subdivision. The homes were adorned with ornate scrollwork and looming towers. In truth, they were sham houses of shoddy, incomplete construction and paper-thin walls. The buyer was expected to finish the work. The idea was to ensnare people desperate for immediate housing who wanted to live in Winnetka to collect the down payment. Unable to complete the work or make the mortgage, the buyer would be forced out, and the next buyer moved in. This Mears house stood exactly where the Hubbard Woods School is today. This photograph was taken with a child's homemade camera. Only one house was ever completed, seen here on the corner of Green Bay Road and Westmore. Here we see that same spot today. One by one, each property was foreclosed upon. Mears lined his pockets before fleeing the country, and Winnetka was stuck with a row of 13 fake houses.
Mears bought the land at $5 a foot, then put these shells up. They gave the appearance of being mansions, but they were so cheaply constructed they could hardly stand by themselves when a stiff wind struck them. They were colder than barns. Many people lost all they had in these ventures.
The flimsy structures began falling apart. They became a haunt for rats, bats, screech owls, chimney birds, and the homeless.
Strange lights were said to flit through the rooms. Not a child would venture into one of these houses alone. Frank Wines.
Residents complained, but the village felt powerless to do anything about them. Then one night, lightning struck one of the towers and it caught fire. Soon the building was engulfed. Then the one beside it caught fire and also burned. What was once an eyesore was now a monstrosity. Finally, the village had had enough and razed them all at once, ending Winnetka's first encounter with unscrupulous developers. Marion McConnell was 15 years old when she lived in Lakeside.
We lived in the only finished house in the so-called Mears Addition, just across the street from the tracks. We were literally in the woods, surrounded by wildflowers. The only drawback to this idyllic spot were the numerous idle tramps plodding up and down the railroad. Early one Saturday afternoon, I was reading in the library when I heard someone come up the steps. Thinking it was one of the boys with an armful of wood, I rushed to open the door, and stood face to face with the most villainous man I had ever seen. He pushed me into the hall, grabbed my wrists and said, "You alone in this house, sis?" Frightened almost to rigidity, I managed to say no and screamed for my mother. She was upstairs getting dressed to go out. Recognizing the terror in my voice, she came as quickly as possible and stood halfway down the stairs clad in a voluminous wrapper, her hair hanging about her shoulders. She asked the man what he wanted. "A night's lodging," he replied. "It's much too early in the day to be looking for a night's lodging," Mother said. "Now go." And she whipped out something from the folds of her wrapper. In the half-light of the hall, it looked like a pistol. The tramp backed out the door and ran down the steps and away. It was a monkey wrench. The next day, Father bought a revolver in the city and insisted we learn how to use it. I was more afraid of the revolver than a dozen roving men. But the tramps kept away from our door. Perhaps because we practiced firing out back at the house.
Under the influence of liquor, the Frenchman dances, the Italian sings, the American talks, and the Irish and the Indian fight. J.B. Turner, Chicago.
On May 1st, 1850, a group of 9 devout Methodists gathered in a Chicago law office above a hardware store for a prayer meeting. It was a prestigious group: lawyers, doctors, ministers, a railroad tycoon, a former mayor, a founder of the Board of Trade. They wanted to pray about starting a new school. They didn't know what kind of school or where it would be located. Just a place of what they called sanctified learning. At the end of the meeting, they were unanimous. It would be a university, one for the whole Northwest, centered in a righteous town, to insulate it from Chicago's degenerate environment. As with the proverbial chicken or egg, it's impossible to know which came first, Evanston the town or Northwestern the university, for they were conceived simultaneously. The search for a suitable location led the men to a lakeside farm owned by Dr. John Foster near the town of Ridgeville. When they finally toured the site in July, the men threw their hats in the air and shouted, "This is the place." The leader of the group was Dr. John Evans, for whom the town would be named. At Rush Medical Center, Evans worked tirelessly to stem Chicago's many cholera outbreaks. Earlier in his career, he had fought for the rights of the mentally ill. He petitioned the government to build hospitals for them instead of the common practice of throwing them into prisons. Evans was an ardent abolitionist, becoming a conductor for the Underground Railroad, helping runaway slaves reach Canada. He became a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln, founded the Illinois Republican Party, and was instrumental in helping Lincoln win the nomination in Chicago. Lincoln even visited Evanston and gave a speech from the front porch of a house on Ridge Road at church. Evans was also a strict temperance man, and in 1855, Evanston established the 4-mile limit. No alcohol could be bought or sold or publicly consumed within a 4-mile radius of Northwestern University. The impact the 4-mile limit had on the area cannot be overstated. For the next century, it became one of the region's defining characteristics. The goal may have been to erect a barrier around the university, but it proved a buffer between Chicago and the whole North Shore. Winnetka was the first after Evanston to establish its own ban on alcohol. One by one, each village drafted similar legislation. There were 2 holdouts, Highwood and Grosse Pointe. Highwood was located next to Fort Sheridan, and there was no chance of depriving servicemen of their liquor. Grosse Pointe was populated by German Catholics, who did not share the temperance sentiment. Their dry Protestant neighbors dubbed them the Wets, but that didn't stop some of them from frequenting the numerous taverns lined up along Ridge just south of Lake. The Chicago Liquor League sued to overturn the 4-mile limit, and won. The university appealed, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. As it turned out, the lawyer representing the Liquor League was so drunk he was unable to present his case. The justices asked Northwestern's counsel to argue both sides. Then the court upheld the ban. Unfortunately for Dr. Evans, he never got to see his experiment flourish. Lincoln offered him a number of posts, all of which he turned down. But when the president asked him to be governor of the Colorado Territory, Evans reluctantly accepted. If Evanston set the moral standard for the North Shore, Winnetka set the intellectual one.
Liberty produces wealth, and wealth, in turn, destroys liberty. Henry Demarest Lloyd.
He's been called America's first investigative reporter, the first and most influential of the muckrakers, a champion of the poor and the outcast, a social activist who fought to end child labor, a David taking on industrial Goliaths. The son of a Dutch Reformed minister, Henry Demarest Lloyd grew up in poverty in a household that discouraged all frivolity. Instead of playing, he spent his childhood reading. Though he rejected his father's religion, he inherited his moralistic zeal. Lloyd preached a gospel of social reform, activism, radicalism. As a young lawyer fresh out of Columbia, he was part of a team of lawyers who helped expose New York's corrupt city government, Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall. This attracted the attention of Chicago Tribune publisher Joseph Medill, who hired Lloyd as an editor. Lloyd quickly gained a reputation as a crack investigative reporter, uncovering fraud and crooked business practices, the first of his kind in the field. His work inspired Upton Sinclair, paving the way for his groundbreaking book, The Jungle. In response to brutal and abusive working conditions, Lloyd displayed unbridled contempt for the captains of industry, big business, and big oil.
Standard Oil has done everything with the Pennsylvania legislature except refine it.
His exposé, Corner on Coffins, uncovered the casket industry's attempt to monopolize the funeral business.
Monopoly is business at the end of its journey.
As Lloyd veered left, Medill and the Tribune moved right. This, coupled with a nervous breakdown, resulted in his leaving the paper. He needed a quiet place to rest and recuperate. He retired to Winnetka at age 31 and lived out his days in this brick house on Sheridan Road. Originally located across the street, John Garland had built it in 1850. Lake erosion motivated him to move it to its present site. In homage to the Patterson Tavern, Lloyd dubbed it the Wayside Inn. His wealthy father-in-law, William Bross, one of the founders of the Tribune and the lieutenant governor of Illinois, purchased the land around it. The house became a hotbed of liberal agitation. Among the luminaries who frequented Wayside were famed attorney Clarence Darrow, reformer Jane Addams, and socialist Eugene Debs. Booker T. Washington visited as well. Addams sent needy children to live there for short periods of time, calling the Wayside an annex to Hull House. The neighbors may have thought Lloyd's politics radical, but they found him personable and genteel.
What I remember most about Lloyd is not the brilliant writer, the social activist, but a man of such wonderful personal charm in his daily conversation. Arthur Hadley.
Above all, they were impressed that he was so civic-minded. At the request of Quincy Dowd, pastor of the Congregational Church, Lloyd helped create the Winnetka Town Meeting. Inspired by the New England Town Meeting, these gatherings became a focal point of social activity for decades. Once a month, the entire population of Winnetka gathered at the church for a lecture or debate or performance. At the time, the church was located on Elm Street across from Peck's Place. Here we see that same spot today. There were lectures on everything from science to gardening to archaeology and vegetarianism. There were debates on prohibition and divorce laws. There was a debate on whether or not the Columbian Exposition should be opened on Sundays. There were guest speakers like Colonel Francis Parker, who spoke on progressive education. Winnetka would later become world famous for implementing many of Parker's ideas. Lloyd invited Jane Addams and Clarence Darrow to speak. There were skits and musicals. Quincy Dowd started another Winnetka tradition as well, one that lasts to this day: the 4th of July celebration on the village green.
From all sorts of places they welcomed all the races to settle on their shore. They didn't care which one, the poor or the rich one, they still had room for more. To give them protection by popular election, a set of rules they wrote. They're your laws, they're my laws, for your cause and my cause, and that's just why I quote: America, I love ya, you're like a sweetheart of mine. From ocean to you my devotion is crossing each boundary line. Just like a little baby climbing its mother's knee. America, I love ya, and there's 100 million others like me. Just like a little baby climbing its mother's knee. Mommy, America, I love you, and there's 100 million others like me.
Meanwhile, Lloyd continued his writing, distilling his ideas into widely publicized essays, articles, and books. His insights were praised by future Supreme Court Justice William Brandeis and Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy. He had his detractors, too. The New York Times noted that while he may have been a fine journalist, he didn't understand basic economics. And many considered it an hypocrisy that this advocate of the poor lived in a lakeside estate in an upper-middle-class neighborhood supported by his wife's family money. But then Lloyd did something that made even his allies turn against him. The year was 1886. Animus between labor and management was reaching a boiling point as the former began to unionize for workplace reforms, like an 8-hour workday. Many radical groups, such as the anarchists, joined in the fight. At the end of an uneventful rally in Haymarket Square, one in which the mayor spoke to a peaceful crowd, someone threw a bomb into a line of policemen. 7 of them were blown apart, others horribly maimed. A riot broke out. Shots were fired. Dozens lay dead, over 100 injured. The city was in an uproar, the nation appalled, the capitalists terrified. 8 anarchists were arrested and charged with the crime. But Marshall Field, Philip Armour, Cyrus McCormick, and others envisioned hordes of anarchists tramping up to Lake Forest and murdering them all in their beds. Their fears were not unfounded. The anarchist manifesto included revolution and assassination. American President William McKinley would later be added to the long list of heads of state murdered by anarchists. Lake Forest needed protection. It needed a fort. Fort Sheridan was built for the express purpose of protecting Lake Forest's elite from Chicago's anarchists. Originally called Fort Highwood, it was renamed to honor Civil War hero Phil Sheridan. During the fire, Sheridan had brought law and order after some initial looting. He lived here for a dozen years, becoming a favorite of the upper class. Even the road leading from the city to the fort, sometimes called Lake, sometimes called Green Bay, was renamed Sheridan. And that road ran past the home of Henry Demarest Lloyd, who shocked his friends and colleagues when he decided to publicly defend the anarchists. He was convinced that in their thirst for vengeance, city officials arrested innocent men. He petitioned the state to commute their death sentences. Lloyd lost the case. 4 of the men were hanged. 1 committed suicide. The rest remained jailed. Lloyd's action infuriated Chicagoans in general and high society in particular. He was shunned by the aristocracy. His neighbors avoided him. His own father-in-law, William Bross, disinherited him. Lloyd suffered a second mental breakdown and took to his sickbed. In his third-floor study, he continued writing. He churned out 7 books, including the most famous volume, Wealth Against Commonwealth. He played a key role in the coal miners' strike and the Chicago Railway strike. He became known as the Apostle of Labor Disputes. On September 28, 1903, Henry Lloyd died of pneumonia at his home in Winnetka. He was 56 years old. In the late 19th century, a string of lurid homicides shattered Winnetka's idyllic reputation, prompting the press to dub it Murder Town. One bright Sunday morning, elderly Irishman Cain Higgins crossed through a field in Lakeside on his way to church when someone crept up behind him and struck him with a rock. The old man collapsed in the tall grass. He was then shot to death 3 times through the neck. His body was not discovered until that evening after his wife reported him missing. On a tip from the town grocer, Charles Goss, police arrested a poor German immigrant named William Schweigart. Schweigart had borrowed Goss's gun to kill skunks, but never returned it. Goss happened to have marked the bullets in a distinct way, and these were the very ones used to kill Higgins. Police asked Schweigart to produce the gun. He said it was stolen. Police scoured the property and uncovered it, buried in the barn. Schweigart confessed to the crime. His motive? Revenge. The wealthy Irishman had hired him to do various chores, but always shortchanged him, 50 cents here, $1 there. Whenever Schweigart demanded full payment, Higgins would just laugh at him. The total amount owed? $35. The defense tried a risky move, claiming Higgins had raped Schweigart's mentally deranged wife. The jury found this implausible, considering Higgins' age and the woman's ever-present protective children. They gave Schweigart life in Joliet. Then in the winter of 1881, a 10-year-old boy was walking through the ravines north of Tower Road when he made a gruesome discovery. Propped up against a tree was a naked, headless body. No one was reported missing, and the authorities had no clue as to who he was. That spring, a group of boys were playing on Tower Road Beach when little Tommy Dwyer dug his hand into the sand and felt something cold and slimy. He grabbed hold of the object, pulling up a human head. The authorities knew the incidents were connected, so to speak, but still had no clue as to who he was or who killed him. Later that year, one of Henry Lloyd's servants discovered a discarded German uniform hidden in a cistern. It had belonged to the victim. Lloyd became obsessed with the case, and after a lengthy investigation, discovered the man was Ignaz Hopf, a former mayor who fled Germany, leaving his wife a cryptic note.
I have by power of attorney authorized you to assume complete control of my property. You can do with it whatever you like. My dear Mamie, forgive me for causing you so much pain from my departure. I cannot write you the reason for it, but do not think it's because of some infidelity on my part. The greatest pain I now have is for those who belong to me. Embrace my children.
His murder was never solved. But the most sensational crime, the one that inspired the nickname, was the murder of 2 of the most well-loved people in town. 2 of Winnetka's founders, James and Mary Wilson. Wilson served as village president for 6 years. Tall, thin, stately, his long white hair draped about his shoulders, he reminded people of an Old Testament patriarch. He started the first commercial store here on the northeast corner of Willow and Maple, a general store which he ran himself, selling groceries and hardware. There was no bank at the time, and he lent money freely, motivated by his desire to see the young village grow. Mary Wilson functioned like the town nurse, despite being confined to a wheelchair. Before there were any doctors here, folks brought the sick to the Wilson home.
To be sure, the prescription was usually a dose of castor oil or a homemade calomel pill. With few exceptions, the ailing one was restored to health because of, or in spite of, the prescribed dose. Grace Sloat.
The couple were also recognized for their strong political opinions. Mary had known Abraham Lincoln and had a reputation as a red-hot Republican. Once she received a gift wrapped in newspaper. When she realized the paper was the pro-Democrat Chicago Times, she threw it, gift and all, into the fire. The couple's only child, George, had been a doctor. During the Civil War, he fought to end yellow fever, when he contracted the disease and died. The Wilsons were devastated.
I have had days of desolation and anguish, and have cried out, "What is life that I should desire it?" But time dulls the sharp edges of affliction. We must submit to the inevitable. What a wretched existence if it were not so.
George's Civil War sword hung proudly on the wall of the Wilson home, a painful reminder of their loss. Every day, neighbor Emma Dwyer visited the elderly Mrs. Wilson to help her with whatever she needed. One morning in February, Emma found the doors locked. This was highly unusual. When no one responded to her calls, Emma broke a back window. She saw Mr. Wilson slumped behind the wood stove. Frantic, she ran to get help. When she and a neighbor returned, they discovered that Mr. Wilson had been shot to death. Upstairs, the scene was much more gruesome. Mary Wilson had been murdered in her sickbed, hacked to pieces with her son's Civil War sword. When the young men of Winnetka heard the news, they were certain they knew who did it: Neil McCage. McCage was a raging alcoholic with a violent temper, known for aiming his pistol at anyone and everyone, threatening to shoot them. The same kind of pistol used to kill Wilson. McCage owed Wilson a great deal of money he borrowed to start a butcher shop on Elm Street. Whenever Wilson asked him to pay back the loan, McCage became irate and threatened him. The young men of Winnetka charged the butcher shop to lynch him. They might have succeeded if Robert Moth hadn't intervened, pleading with the mob to let him have a fair trial. The murder and subsequent trial became national news. All the evidence, however, was circumstantial, and not enough for a conviction. The jury felt compelled to let him go. After his release, McCage closed shop and left town for Minnesota, where less than a year later, he was killed in a bar fight.
The truth of the murder died with him. Jesse Prouty.
The Wilson home was located right next to the railroad tracks. As trains slowed for Winnetka, conductors announced, "Murder Town next, Murder Town." Noses pressed against the glass to view the house, scene of such grisly slayings. The curious poured off the train in droves. Others rode in from the country to glimpse the haunted house for themselves. The house was sold and moved from its original location to Spruce and Green Bay. Seen here. It was torn down in 1960 to make way for the A&P grocery store. There would not be another murder in Winnetka for the next 50 years. For nearly 100 years, Academy Hall was one of the most important buildings in Winnetka, serving a variety of functions, just not the one it was intended for. Located where the fire station is today, it was to be the Winnetka College, an extension of the University of Chicago, complete with its own dormitory. But construction delays caused by lumber shortages after the fire doomed the enterprise. Instead, it would accommodate a grade school, the first high school, the public library, the town auditorium, the village hall, and lastly, the fire station. Johnny Burns attended school there between 1869 and 1881.
Miss Hattie Doolittle taught our class at the old academy. She had the time of her life when she undertook to teach, but she took sick and died. My mother said the students killed her. Our class was the dirtiest, filthiest, most corruptible school of scholars that ever disgraced Winnetka, and Eddie Filkins was the worst. He could do more cutting up to annoy that teacher than anyone else. I see her break down weeping. We wanted Old Man Pierce to crack his broom handle over Eddie's head. One day, Millie Martin brought some pepper and ginger to school, and she gave each scholar some of it to make them sneeze. Well, all of us 50 scholars sneezed and sneezed. Classes were called off on account of the epidemic. We were all dismissed and told to go home. Another time we got Jimmy Mahoney to fix it so that when he was attending the furnace in the basement, he should close the draft and open it up on the wrong side so it would cause the smoke to fill the classroom. Which he did, and we got another holiday. Mrs. Goss was one teacher who was severe in her commands. We were having examination, and this girl, Angie, whispered to someone for something. Mrs. Goss spoke to her, and then she whispered again. Mrs. Goss said, "Angie, come here." And Angie came forward. Mrs. Goss slapped her across the face. She was wearing a heavy gold wedding ring, and when it went across her nose and mouth, the girl started bleeding all over the place. She took her to the hall where there was a wash basin, but it kept bleeding. Let me tell you, that old teacher was pretty scared. I don't know if today's scholars get floggings or not, but in those early days in the backwoods long ago, we used to get it sometimes.
In 1899, the Horace Mann School was built on Chestnut, between Elm and Oak. Here we see that same spot today. New Trier opened in 1901. Inspired by the town hall in Trier, Germany, the building was still under construction when classes started. Students used the cavernous, unfinished second floor to play indoor baseball. Extracurricular activities that first year included girls cleaning out kerosene lamps and boys milking cows. Early attempts at starting a football team were shut down. Many considered the sport too violent. With no auditorium, students took the train up to Ravinia to perform in high school plays and musicals. Early graduation ceremonies were also held at Ravinia. The first graduation ceremony on May 1st, 1901 was short and sweet. There were only 2 graduates. Winnetka's founders would have been thrilled to learn that New Trier consistently ranks as one of the best high schools in the country. Academy Hall then became the Village Hall. Prior to this, the village government had been meeting in the train station. One night in early 1900, all of Winnetka turned out for an unusual performance in the upstairs auditorium. As the gas lamps dimmed, the excited audience hushed. The room was in near darkness. Then village president Frank Herman rose to the platform. He flipped a switch, turning on an electric light bulb. The crowd went wild, jumping to their feet, cheering. Women rushed forward with bouquets of flowers. They were not starved for entertainment. It meant Winnetka's power plant was up and running. The plant had been built on the beach beside the pumping station, which was also new. The station pumped water into a huge brick tower built on the bluff. The water tower became Winnetka's most recognizable landmark, and North Avenue was renamed Tower Road. It was a favorite tourist attraction, offering panoramic views of the whole area. One hardy bride even hosted her wedding there, making her guests climb the steps all the way to the top. But the event that night at Academy Hall wasn't over. After the electricity was turned on, Samuel Greeley strode to the platform. The audience quieted down again. They listened in rapt attention as he pretended to make 2 phone calls. When he finished, more enthusiastic applause followed. It meant phone service would also be installed that year. By the time the village government moved to its new home on Linden in 1925, Academy Hall was falling apart. Architect Spencer S. Beeman lopped off the top floor and transformed it into a French Normandy-style chateau to serve as the new fire station, dubbed the Fireman's Castle. The building was finally torn down in 1953, replaced with this short-lived modern structure. In 1972, after bricks began falling off the old water tower, it too was torn down. A.W. Stevens from Springfield, Massachusetts, visited Winnetka around the turn of the century.
I like the suburbs of Chicago much better than the city itself. And in them I spent most of my time. Winnetka is the most charming of the many charming towns scattered along the North Shore to Milwaukee. The streets are perfect arbors, giving it an altogether sylvan appearance. Wild, one might even say, considering the rank undergrowth on all the vacant lots, of which there are many. The occupants of some of the most elegant estates have scrupulously preserved this natural condition of the land. Gas is banished from the village streets that the trees might not be destroyed by it. As a result of this defensive care of the natural conditions, Winnetka is a perfect paradise for birds and squirrels who occupy as though they were propertied citizens of the place. And the multitude of happy, bareheaded children whose sweet faces are everywhere to be seen here, who live on the streets and the lawns, they warm my heart. Although there are many New England people in Winnetka, they appear to have become thoroughly westernized. In place of our Puritan reserve, stiffness, and formality, they've taken on an unconventional, hearty, hospitable manner. Everybody knows everybody, and family thresholds are easily crossed and recrossed. And yet there is no lack of refinement and culture in Winnetka. In fact, these, and not wealth, give tone to its society. But it is all simple, free, and gracious. If one must live in Chicago, then one should eat, sleep, love, and pray in Winnetka.
Just before the close of the 19th century, a horse-drawn wagon pulled up to the home of Mr. James Pugh with a large crate, special delivery from Germany. Inside was an automobile, Winnetka's first. The vehicle had no steering wheel but a rudder. It shook so violently it appeared to expand and contract. It spewed great plumes of black smoke. It couldn't make the smallest grade and had to be towed up the Oak Street Hill. And it was so unreliable, Pugh hired a horse and wagon from Richardson's livery to follow him around whenever he went for a drive. To most people, it was a joke, an expensive toy at best, and they teased James Pugh to no end. But soon more cars appeared. The machinery was improving. Cars began zipping through town at the ungodly speed of 20 miles per hour, a serious threat to Winnetka's serenity. Residents were up in arms. Something had to be done. Police were dispatched to Sheridan Road to ticket anyone exceeding 18 miles per hour. To clock speed in those days, policemen hid in staggered bushes, using flags and stopwatches. To halt an offending vehicle, they raised a rope across Sheridan Road. Luckily, no one was beheaded. Then village engineer Frank Wines accidentally came up with a simpler way to slow traffic. When he installed several pedestrian walkways on Sheridan Road in Winnetka and Glencoe, he inadvertently created the world's first speed bumps. They were 6 inches high and 6 feet wide, made of brick and stone. Cars could safely cross them at only 3 miles per hour. If a car hit one of those bumps at 20 miles an hour, the driver was ejected, the axle sometimes broken. This is Sheridan Road in Glencoe, after just such an accident. Glencoe was sued to have the bumps removed. The village won. The bumps remained.
Glencoe won the case and the bumps were written up in newspapers around the world. The fast auto drivers of Europe made much fun of this particular system of speed regulation. Frank Wines.
But as Winnetka's village council members became car owners, the bumps began disappearing one by one. The last of these deadly walkways was not removed until the 1930s. But speed bumps would prove the most trivial engineering feat Frank Wines had to offer the village.